Thank you very much, Tommy. I wish I had time to say a few wonderful words about you also. But rather than take away from the talk, let me begin by doing a couple of things in housekeeping. That's always appropriate with my name. Each of you have at your chair our facility my newest book that's come out. This is from Harvest House on the Jesus Who Never Lived. Deliberately named that to get you to look at it a second time. And if you have a desire for that, I have some information on the back. You can follow that, and I'll be glad to send you an autographed copy. Secondly, if you would like to be on my new email newsletter, which I evaluate the different kinds of contemporary issues as well as biblical and theological themes, other such things, please feel free to give me a business card with your email address on the back. Give me a piece of paper or whatever, and I'll be glad to put you on the email list to receive newsletter and information on my new blog and internet program and those things. The third thing, and that relates directly to the paper. Initially, this paper was supposed to deal with Josephus and the early fathers. I, first of all, last year, in thinking about this paper, went all the way back through reading through Josephus's 7 books on the War of the Jews, and not finding anything about preterism in there, I continued on to study the church fathers and found nothing about it there either, so I decided not to do this paper today. So no, actually, in doing the research on the fathers, I decided just too much information to talk about to include it in this paper, so I'll have to do it in a subsequent one. I thought I would just settle on Josephus, since most of you would like to have some other paper be given today. Let's start off here then with Josephus and the fall of Jerusalem, and evaluation of the preterist view on Jerusalem in prophecy. The Olivet Discourse that Jesus delivered shortly before his death, resurrection, and departure from the earth has figured prominently in discussions regarding eschatology. One system of eschatology, known as preterism, has attached its very existence to a particular meaning of this discourse. Preterists believe that all, full preterist, or most, partial preterist, of Jesus' words in Matthew 24, 1 through 44, Mark 13, 1 through 37, and Luke 21, 5 through 36, were fulfilled when Jerusalem and the temple was destroyed. Thus the term preterism, Latin praeter, meaning past, speaks of the prophecies from the Messiah about the future destruction of Jerusalem, the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel 9, 23 through 27, the events leading to the end of the age, and the future coming of the Son of Man, were largely, if not entirely, fulfilled in AD 70. The intent of this paper is not to present a biblical case against preterism. You got a preterist running this thing? What is this? You hear that noise? Wow. Many scholars, some within this conference, have ably done this. Instead, I will deal only with how preterists have used the writings of Josephus to bolster their claims. First, preterists have asserted the destruction of Jerusalem as recorded by Josephus reveals significant affinity with the words of Jesus in the Olivet Discourse. Second, they affirm that events leading up to the siege of Jerusalem and the final fall of the city are reflected in the descriptions of Josephus in his Bellum Judaicum, the Jewish War. To examine each of these purported comments by Joseph, said to be fulfillments of John 24 and others, is more than may be fairly dealt with in a paper of this length. Preterist David Chilton offered a large number of passages from Josephus that he claimed reveal connection to the predictions of Jesus. They're just page after page after page. Unfortunately, he offered little or no explanation as to why these passages actually fulfill the predictions of the Olivet Discourse, assuming apparently that quoting the words of Josephus made a prima facie case for his thesis. It reminds me of last year in the debate. Just quoting of Scripture does not indicate any proof. I always tell my students, assertion is not a proof. I have narrowed down the scope of this study to a more modest endeavor by interacting with David Padfields. That's something I found on the internet. He had it nice, laid out, standard preterist way of doing it, which is an attempt to parallel the components of Jesus' words with portions of Josephus and a few other historians. To accomplish this task, I will look at the various predictive elements of Jesus' words in Matthew 24 primarily, and mentioning any significant differences in Mark 13 and Luke 21 to determine if words and descriptions given by Josephus in the Jewish war, and by the way, there is just a tiny bit in the Antiquities that I will mention, but largely we're talking about the Jewish war, truly are historical fulfillment of Jesus' discourse on the Mount of Olives. After dealing with the broader strokes of the Olivet Discourse, I will confine myself to the matter of the coming of the false Christs and the abomination of desolation. The matter of the actual sign of the coming of the Son of Man is also significant, but since not all preterists would view this being fulfilled at the fall of Jerusalem, this will be passed over in this paper. Before examination of the arguments from certain preterists, let us briefly look at why these two sources, that is, the works of Josephus, for preterists are so important to them. The writings of Josephus on the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Preterist writings abound with references to Josephus, mostly the war. Under this understanding of the Jewish historian's account of Jerusalem's fall, he is said to describe, even in great detail, the words of our Lord. Quote, this quote is from an unknown author. I got it off a Preterist website. The fulfillment of our Lord's prophecy respecting Jerusalem is portrayed in the pages of Josephus with terrible exactness. We may perhaps without presumption ascribe the existence of his works to divine providence. Josephus, that's why I think it's probably the fifth gospel now. For there are few persons who have read his narrative that have not felt themselves more deeply impressed than ever with the solemn truths of Scripture. I'm one of the ones who apparently is not impressed. And the tremendous certainty of the divine judgments, end quote. Another author says that Josephus' account parallels exactly the prophecies of Jesus. Having been an eyewitness of the scenes which he describes, he quotes, he has given a most authentic account of the miseries as well as of the unparalleled crimes of this nation. Though a Jew and by no means intending to favor Christianity, and though he suppresses most of what related to its author, and I assume that author, since it's capital, means God. That's sort of an interesting concept. Yet his history of fact shows the fulfillment of the predictions of Jesus of Nazareth as well as those of Moses to the very letter. This is amazing praise, having read the books all the way through and couldn't find anything. And Eusebius, famous church historian but also anti-Semite and anti-Chiliast, put much stock in Josephus' account being a record of the predictions of Christ. Quote, if anyone compares the words of our Savior with the other accounts of the historian, that is Josephus, concerning the whole war, how can one fail to wonder and to admit that the foreknowledge and the prophecy of our Savior were truly divine and marvelously strange? So Eusebius liked Josephus too. So if one believes that the prophetic statements are either partially or entirely fulfilled in the fall of Jerusalem, one cannot go to any other source than the account of Josephus for this information. Some are sort of second-hand, but Josephus is first-hand. His is the only eyewitness record we have of Jerusalem's destruction. He explains in great detail the events leading up to the war, important persons within the Jewish community and the Roman army, the struggles within the cities among rival zealots, and the activities of the Romans both in diplomacy with the people of Jerusalem and the combat between the Jews and the Romans. In anticipation of this paper for the Pre-Trib conference, I went back through every paragraph of the 7 books of Josephus, the Jewish war, to discover if indeed what Josephus recorded, and I might say based on these quotes I just gave you, miraculously and exactly recorded, the details of Jesus' words in his discourse to his disciples on the Mount of Olives. I did not find this to be so, in spite of a quite pretentious claim by Preterist. What follows is an assessment of this claim by the Preterist quoted above. We shall set forth the predictions of Jesus throughout the Olivet Discourse essentially in the order of the Matthean text, as found in the Preterist David Padfield. Since our specific focus will be on the matter of false Christ and the abomination of desolation at the end, And I should just warn you ahead of time, by the time I got to the end and realized I was 21 pages single-spaced, I thought, well, maybe I'll deal with them a little more in depth some other time. But I do deal with it, but I thought I could write a bunch more pages here, and I better not. But we shall reserve these to the end of the paper. As mentioned earlier, I'm relying on two preterists for this list of signs, David Chilton and David Padfield. The former being of limited value, since Chilton primarily quotes large sections of Josephus' account of the siege and destruction, but provides little helpful commentary on how these tragic circumstances are parallels with the words of Jesus. While Chilton provides considerable Josephan text, but little else, I should rely then on the other as the representative preterist for the study. Many others could be picked up. I could have picked up Tommy's real close friend, Gentry, or some others, but we'll use the one I have. Not one stone shall be left on another. After leaving the Temple Mount on their way to the Mount of Olives, the disciples of Jesus were admiring the magnificence of the temple buildings, which would have stood in array upon traveling through the Kidron Valley and climbing the mount. Jesus used this question as an opportunity to teach regarding the destruction of Jerusalem. I think that's true. Quote, and he said to them, do you not see all these things? Looking at these buildings. Truly I say to you that not one stone here will be left upon another which will not be torn down. And I take that specifically not about the retaining walls, but about what the disciples talked. Look at all these wonderful buildings. He didn't say, look at all these wonderful retaining walls. And so he's referring specifically to that which is on the top of the structure, not that which surrounded. I've had people say, well, look at there, you had some stones left that weren't turned over. I said, yes, but those aren't the buildings. Find me part of the buildings up there. Okay. When one travels to the city of Jerusalem today, he will discover not a single one of the temple buildings remains that were admired by the disciples of Jesus. The only obvious evidence of the destruction of the temple are the stones that lie at the western wall that were pushed off the Temple Mount retaining wall by the angry Romans and fell to their present position. Those of you who know much about this know that they had to clear out a lot of those stones. They only left some examples behind. There was far more there in the initial excavation. This prophecy of Jesus was literally fulfilled. Padfield quotes the alleged words of Titus that he did not desire the destruction of the temple. Few would disagree that these words of Jesus, stated in reference to the disciples' comments, and therefore his discussion of the sign of his coming and the end of the age, refer to the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. That is, there's a big debate, and I don't want to get into that debate, whether Titus had intended or not intended to destroy the temple. But the point of it is, it's not there, and that fulfills Jesus' words. Now, wars and rumors of wars. Beginning in verse 6, we observe a list of statements by Jesus that precede either the destruction of the Jerusalem specifically or the end of the age. 4 of these that correspond to the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, it appears to me, in Revelation 6, war, famine, pestilence, and death. The remainder of Revelation 6 reflects the other aspects of Matthew 24, martyrdom, earthquakes, darkening of the sun, red color of the moon, stars falling from the sky, terror of the earth from the coming of the Son of Man in judgment. All these things are found there. Interestingly, though, each of these first 4 preceded the time of Jesus and has followed even in more massive proportions since the fall of Jerusalem. That is, when you look at these things that are supposedly a clear indication of the fall of Jerusalem being, in fact, the fulfillment of Matthew 24, I do see those things there. And I also see them before Jesus was born. I also find them after the fall of Jerusalem. So what does all that mean? Are they really of that valuable predictive value? How then may they have this predictive value? The first of these relatively normal events begins with wars and rumors of wars. Quote, you will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened. For those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. Padfield himself acknowledges that wars and rumors of wars was commonplace in the ancient world, as is also true today, but then draws a false conclusion. Quote, it is hard to picture a time more trying than just prior to the destruction of Jerusalem, end quote. He then comments from Tacitus and Josephus to demonstrate a comparison with the words of Christ. Now, see how close these are here. Tacitus, a Roman historian, he says, said of this period, "The history on which I am entering is that of a period rich in disasters, terrible with battles, torn by civil struggles, horrible even in peace. 4 emperors fell by the sword. There were 3 civil wars, more foreign wars, and often both at the same time," quoting from the histories of Tacitus. Josephus tells of a day in which the, quote, people of Caesarea had slain the Jews that were among them on the very same day and hour, which one would think must have come to pass by the direction of providence, insomuch as that in 1 hour's time about 20,000 Jews were killed, and all Caesarea was emptied of its Jewish inhabitants, end quote. Now, in contrast to this description of the wars of the Roman Empire and in Judea, the conflicts within the Roman Empire were not really wars between kingdoms and nations. That's the first thing I want you to notice. That's the prediction of Jesus. It will be between kingdoms and nations. In the 1st century A.D., that is, if this is referring to this, as described in the Olivet Discourse. However, rather than the local war in Judea, the account in Matthew depicts something on a much broader scale, it appears to me. In the words of Craig Evans, quote, "The expectation of global warfare and chaos, however, there were no major wars prior to the Jewish revolt." So if that's referring to it, it doesn't seem to fit. Moreover, as Mayer has commented, quote, "As for the Parthian Wars and the risings that took place some 10 years later, after in Gaul and Spain, they had no connection whatever to do with Jerusalem or Judea," end quote. That is, if we're going to rely upon these statements of Jesus, as you'll see in a little bit, that these are what are referring immediately to the fall of Jerusalem, that is the fulfillment of Matthew 24, and part of it is all relating it to kingdoms and nations coming against each other. You don't have kingdoms and nations coming against each other, first of all, in Judea prior to this time. You can't do that. And you don't have it in the Roman world at this time. So what's it referring to if that is referring directly before this period of time? It's just a question in my mind. What Padfield does not say is that prior to the war in Judea, the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, controlled the ancient Mediterranean world in most instances. Sadler says, quote, "If this verse is a sequence of the previous one, then it can hardly refer to the time before the destruction of Jerusalem. For then the Roman power kept the peace of the world. It is consequently explained by many commentators as fulfilled in various local tumults between the Jews who were scattered everywhere and the various Gentile nations amongst whom they dwelt. But this by no means answers to such expressions as nation against nation and kingdom against kingdom. They seem rather to refer to such a time as the present, when the civilized world is divided into many separate nationalities." You don't have that framework in the Roman Empire at that time. That's why you could move everywhere you wanted with no need to worry about boundaries. Now, thus the modern world with national boundaries and independent sovereign states better fits with modern times than with that of the Roman Empire at the time of the Jewish revolt. Another problem with connecting the predictions of wars with those referring to the Roman war against the Jews is that Jesus says that they are the beginning of birth pangs. Not the finality, not the end of the age. Even the death toll in the Bar Kokhba revolt was nearly 600,000, though the Talmud sometimes gives the amount even in the millions. I suspect that as bad as the destruction of Jerusalem may have been, there have been numerous events in human history, say the trenches of World War I, the Jewish Holocaust, the Khmer Rouge, which were more devastating than even the descriptions that Josephus provided in the tragedy of Jerusalem. That is to say that this event in Jerusalem is equivalent to like what you find in the Revelation or the end of the world, from my perspective. As bad as it is, it's not bad as it can be. And it will even get worse in my perspective. Famines and pestilences. Next in the scenario painted by Jesus before the end of the age are famines, though Padfield gives pestilences, which in Matthew is found in the KJV and some majority readings, but not in the better Greek manuscripts, in my perspective. And in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. I'll give the NASB here. One does not need to go beyond the New Testament to hear of such famines. In the book of Acts, Luke records a prophecy of Agabus to that effect. As you've already find that being discussed, the famine that was going throughout the world in the time of Claudius, and of course we know Paul going from church to church, gathering up funds to help people back in Judea. Clear there were famines, there's no question about that. But neither Luke nor the Apostle Paul apparently connected this famine with prophetic fulfillment of Christ's words in the Olivet Discourse. I find that interesting. That if the famine here is really a reference to what's occurring right before Jerusalem, so that can be the fulfillment. And I grant there are famines before Jesus, after Jesus, between the time, after the time, throughout the world, famines. But surely the Apostle Paul would have known that this was fulfilling prophecy, and would have said something about this famine that had this prophetic significance to it, which he doesn't. Josephus, and again also the Roman historian Tacitus, is quoted to confirm the kind of famine mentioned by Jesus, and he tells of Queen Helena's relief, and I'm not going to read all of this, for I want to be sure I have plenty of time for Q&A and for Tommy to answer all the questions. But, oh, you're still here, Tommy. I thought you stepped out. Forgive me. But, you know, we have this situation where you do have clearly famine going on. I'm not questioning that. My question is not whether Josephus speaks of a famine. He does. But also there are many other famines that he doesn't speak of. So I think that's reading a little bit more into the text, and I don't think Josephus is exact enough to this generalized statement of famine to say it's a prediction that has been fulfilled. It is not unusual to have famines in the ancient or even modern world. And certainly these mentioned by Josephus and Tacitus are not more famines than have been experienced in various parts of the world. The biblical text mentions famine over 100 times. What about earthquakes? Earthquakes are a common occurrence throughout the world. One of the most massive in the Mediterranean world happened in the 8th century, which toppled temples, other buildings, and entire cities. J. Marcellus Kick said, regarding the time immediately before the fall of Jerusalem, that there were earthquakes in Crete, Smyrna, Miletus, and on and on and on. And all these places, like Pompeii, was damaged much by an earthquake occurring February the 5th, 63 A.D. But that's not in Judea. It is important for preterists that the various events mentioned by Christ occurred before the destruction of Jerusalem, so that it becomes the major judgment of God on the Jewish people. Damar sees these happenings as being addressed in the first century community in Judea and not to the entire world, and that's the point I'm making. Where do we put these things together? Are we talking about earthquakes, famines, wars throughout the world? Are we talking about them just occurring in Judea? What is the fulfillment of the prophecy that Josephus is talking about? Well, Josephus' interest is pretty well relegated to the question of Judea, and yet that doesn't solve your problems, because you also have ones that he does not speak of, and you do not have the kind of intensity in some of these things as required, I think, in the words of Jesus, particularly as we see the development in the book of Revelation, which is in fact talking about the same issues. Damar's understanding of this generation, or his identification of the you repeated in the text, is referring to the first century audience. That's where he gets it from. My only concern is to demonstrate that the earthquakes and other phenomena were not unusual, occurring before and after the period of time, and do not serve as an introduction to the end of the world within 4 decades of their happening. Moreover, I desire to show that Josephus' words do not spell a disaster of the proportions spoken of in the Olivet Discourse, and certainly not as seen in the Revelation of John. Kistemacher says that the earthquakes mentioned by Jesus should not be directly equated with the earthquakes that occurred near the time of the destruction of Jerusalem. And then I have a lengthy quote here that you can read. By the way, I should tell you one thing I didn't tell you at the beginning. The actual entirety of this paper will be found on the internet, not in your CD. At the time I gave Tommy everything that I had at that point of writing, but now you have it all, and it will be on the internet. So if you run out on your CD, you'll know why. But Kistemacher said these are foreshadowings. Now, Sam Kistemacher is not premill; he's amill. But in reading this passage, he recognizes that these statements that Jesus is talking about are foreshadowings of what is to come, but not something that immediately sort of brings in the final end. There's a time period sometimes of great extent, and even Sam says that, because he moves into the fact periods between 60s and 80s, there were famines and pestilences and earthquakes. The Roman Empire had a lot of these things. He said they're not limited to the decade that precedes the fall of Jerusalem. And he said there are several hundred disturbances of all these things at this period of time. So how do you get them connected with Jerusalem since they precede it and follow it? May I introduce at this juncture that even were we to grant that these statements of Jesus about wars and famines and earthquakes and the like speak of what would transpire from AD 33 to 70, a reasonable position, if we consider all of Jesus' words to be restricted to events within Judea, that Christ is acknowledging these events to be the beginning, not the crescendo, of events leading to the sign of his coming and the end of the age. That is, you have them too close in juxtaposition. If these are the beginnings of pains he talks about in these terms, then these would be on the foothills. I mean, they are right on the destruction itself. And what you find in the text seems to be more elongated than that in time. And I'll go on with Donald Hagner, who mentions the fact that they are not in themselves, these events, signal of the end. He quotes on, I go on down, I'm not going to read all these quotes to you. It is not yet the time of the proper eschatological work of the Messiah, and therefore the Messiah will not yet be present. It is not yet the transition from this age to the age to come. And so part of my issue with Josephus is that we're talking about such a small period of time between when Jesus said these words and the actual destruction of Jerusalem for them to be just simply the very, very beginning of the situation. Particularly since they like to mention the fact there was an earthquake in 66. And that's right on the very heels of it. As Keener says, ancient prophecy teachers usually listed these events among the signs of the end. The end was often portrayed as preceded by great sufferings or a final war. Jesus says instead these events characterize normal life until the end. And I think all we're saying here, and I don't have a major problem with Keener's statements here if taken within context, and that is these wars and rumors of wars and famines and all these things are not really those things. It's just almost like, they happen today, expect Jesus tomorrow. They're setting a stage. They're beginning to happen. They may intensify, but these things have a long time in coming about, and I don't think Josephus' events satisfy that kind of requirement. Fearful events from heaven. More significant than the former signs of common occurrences are the extraordinary sights in the skies, mentioned only in Luke's account. Quote, and there will be terrors and great signs from heaven, end quote. Jesus' use of terrors and great signs would lead one to believe that more than human misfortune and natural calamity is in view. Now think about this with me just a moment. You've got famines and pestilences, which oftentimes come on the heels of famines. And you have these earthquakes and natural calamities. But in reality, when you start seeing fearful events in heaven, these things are a little different than your commonplace, it would seem. The term phobos speaks of a dread sight, something that brings fear, while semeion refers to something that had a terrifying appearance or never before seen. Padfield connects this statement of Christ with a storm mentioned by Josephus. Got to find that prediction fulfilled here in Josephus. So let's see if this fits. This is a quote from War. For there broke out a prodigious storm in the night, with the utmost violence and a very strong winds, with the largest showers of rain, with continual lightnings and terrible thunderings and amazing concussions and bellowings of the earth. That was in an earthquake. These things were a manifest indication that some destruction was coming upon men. When the system of the world was put into this disorder, and anyone would guess that these wonders foreshadowed some great calamities that were coming. Wow, this is fulfillment of Matthew. Other than the earthquake, however, what Josephus describes sounds like a West Texas thunderstorm. Now, I grew up in West Texas. And I've been in rain and thunder and lightning and tornadoes. I've seen things that would make Josephus shake. Well, I've been in major thunderstorms with lightning, heavy rain, strong winds, tornadoes that have knocked down trees, destroyed buildings, created floods of water, and other forms of damage that was terrifying. We used to go out and watch it. One could also observe strange colors in the clouds, darkening of the sky, among other heavenly sights. One really must wonder if what is described by Josephus equates with the magnitude and terror of which Jesus speaks, particularly as the little apocalypse of the Olivet Discourse is supplemented in the book of Revelation, surely the words of Jesus are more ominous than the event that Josephus describes. Again, I've been through many of these ominous situations that Josephus talks about. Paffel finds a more likely example of the type of event offered by Jesus in another identification. He writes, under the war, on another occasion, Josephus wrote, "Thus there was a star resembling a sword which stood over the city, and a comet that continued a whole year. Thus also before the Jewish rebellion so great a light shone around the altar and the holy house that it appeared to be bright daytime, which light lasted for half an hour. Moreover, the eastern gate of the inner court of the temple, which was of brass armed with iron and vastly heavy, and had been with difficulty shut by 20 men, and rested upon a basis armed with an iron, and had bolts fastened very deep into the firm floor, which was made of one entire stone, which was seen to be open of its own accord about the 6th hour of the night." So he said, man, this looks like a Matthew 24 prophetic prediction. Now, this presentation by Josephus is in another class from what has been presented thus far. The mention of common happenings such as wars and famines and earthquakes are not yet unexpected through human history and global in dimension. Before this quote by Padfield, Josephus says that God had given signs to the Jews that were not discerned by them of their future desolation. And to men infatuated without, according to Josephus' quote, as to men infatuated without either eyes to see or minds to consider, did not regard the denunciations that God made to them, end quote. Evidence seems to suggest that the star comet of which Josephus speaks was the Halley Comet, which appeared in the spring of AD 66 and remained for approximately a year. Josephus says that this comet resembled a sword, a description given in the ancient world because of the comet's tail. Very common description in the ancient world. This comet, the star is a sword-like. The mention of a comet standing over a city, as over Bethlehem, seen by the wise men from the east, may have been the comet Halley in 5 BC. This is similar to the report of the Roman historian Diocasius, who said that a comet in 12 BC, again most likely Halley, stood over Rome. This heavenly marvel witnessed by Josephus is not difficult to understand or to accept. The issue is not the actual event by whether it's a fulfillment of Christ's words or independent marvels that have occurred at other times in history, and often associated with important events, such as the appearance of a comet at the outbreak of the war between Pompey and Julius Caesar in 49 BC, or another in 44 BC, 4 months after the assassination of Caesar. Comets in the ancient world carried meaning. And Josephus sees a comet and says, we have meaning. That's so, but my question is that what Jesus is talking about by signs in the heavens above? Well, maybe let's say it is a comet. More problematic, though, is the story of the light in the temple. The text says that when the people came to the temple in the evening to discover a great light shining around the altar in the temple so that it appeared to be at daytime. How would you take this phenomenon? Josephus records this. Rather than reject Josephus' description of a marvel he believes to have come from God, it may well be true that God provided signs of judgment before the destruction of Jerusalem. This would be consistent with the grace of God, allowing people opportunity to repent. That these events directly parallel the predictions of Jesus is the open question, since this marvel in the temple do not relate to the sights of the heavens in Luke. Now, do you see the issue? Padfield would connect these things. He said you have a comet in the heavens and you have a light in the temple. And he said, this fulfills Jesus' promises and predictions. Well, let me grant him that maybe the comet, let's say for his argument, may sound good. But why did you connect that with the light in the temple? Because that has nothing to do with frightful things in the sky. So how is this the fulfillment of Josephus? Plus, I suspect that seeing a comet in the sky is not exactly the kind of phenomenal activity of the sky and the judgment of God that we observe, particularly as we see Revelation as the expansion of Jesus' words here. It's just not enough. He's willing to take so little to be fulfillment of that which seems to be far more dire. The gospel preached to all nations. Preterists believe that the proclamation of the gospel to the Roman Empire, Egypt, and the ancient Near East is equivalent to Jesus' words that the gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world, triggering the end. And then I have a fairly lengthy quote here from, I guess this is also from Padfield, in which I have a statement of the fact that prior to the destruction of Jerusalem, the apostles had gone throughout the world. They'd gone to Egypt, they'd gone to Turkey and Greece, they'd gone to Rome, and then he talks about some went as far as Iraq, and of course in places in Arabia and all these places, so the gospel had been preached in all nations. Well, I realize that Paul does talk about the fact that the gospel has been preached in the world, and you do have quotations of that. But it does not appear to me that you can argue that the apostles by AD 70 had traveled what even would be considered in those days the known world. Plus, whatever we know about that is by tradition and not by Scripture or by historical testimony. So nothing in Josephus speaks to the question of this statement by Jesus, so I will but briefly comment on this interpretation. Many preterists consider the preaching of Paul in the Mediterranean, the traditions of other apostles, to be fulfillment. There are several problems with the above understanding of the words of Jesus. First, if his interpretation is correct, should we understand that the command to disciple all nations in Matthew 28 is complete? In other words, we're going to take Matthew in 24 and say all nations refers to basically that little bitty portion around the Mediterranean. And then we come to Matthew 28 and he says you're to speak to all the nations and disciple them. It seems that I don't have to do that since that's already been covered. So are we going to restrict the all nations in Matthew 28 to the area right around the Mediterranean basin? I think that Jesus had more in view than that. Paul wrote Colossians in AD 60. Are we to understand that the God... Now here's an interesting, AD 60. Are we to understand that the gospel of the kingdom had been completely preached in fulfillment of Paul's words before he wrote these words? You catch that? They want to argue that, well, the gospel of the kingdom must be preached in all the world before AD 70 to be the fulfillment of Jesus as Matthew 24 is mentioned by Josephus. But if that's so, Paul made the statements about it's been preached to every creature under the heavens in AD 60. That's 10 years before the destruction of Jerusalem. At that, Paul could have said, listen, I've already accomplished my task, no sense in doing any more. So when he left his Roman captivity, he could say, I'm going to go back home and visit the family. Or the other apostles would have had no need to do anything else either because it's fulfilled according to this. I don't think that follows very well. Stand before kings and rulers. Again, these words of Jesus are not found in Josephus. Though certainly he is aware of persecution of Jewish believers in Yeshua, he does mention, for example, the martyrdom of James, the half-brother. So the argument here is another fulfillment of Jesus' words is before AD 70, we actually have the apostles standing before kings and before rulers. And based on that, then this is a fulfillment again of Matthew's gospel. I suspect that this falls into the same classification. It's agreed that you have the Apostle Paul, who, by the way, was not at this meeting of Jesus and the apostles. Remember Jesus talking about you? Which of these people stood before kings? If you want to say kings, then we would have to say local kings, like in Judea. If we did that, then we're way before AD 70. And if we want to say someone like Caesar at that time, it would have been, I guess, in Nero in the 60s, then we would say that the other apostles didn't get in on the very thing that Jesus predicted, if it has to go that large. Let's move on to what I think are more significant. I find the reference in Luke to Jerusalem being surrounded by armies to be the most convincing parallel to the Josephine account. Something that both preterists and many futurists can agree. For example, Kenneth Gentry says, quote, the context of Luke demands a literal Jerusalem besieged by, I like these terms. I want you to hear this real good from a preterist because we're going to say more about literal and figurative in a moment. He's insistent on this. He says, well, there's a literal Jerusalem besieged by literal armies in literal Judea, which was a matter of indisputable historical record occurring in the events leading up to AD 70. So he's a real stickler on literal. Thomas Ice says in response, this demonstrates that preterists take Scripture literally, unless it contradicts their presupposed system of theology, at which time they usually come up with a more pliable, deeply spiritual meaning of the text. And I'm going to point this all out to you here in just a moment. I thought this was really an interesting sort of division. But since both preterists and futurists, like myself, that's Tommy speaking, believe that Luke 21:20 through 24 literally refers to Jerusalem in AD 70, then this can be used as a template as to how Scripture speaks of the destruction of Jerusalem in the first century. Now, I'm inclined to agree with this understanding of the passage, but even this interpretation is not required. One only needs to think of the abomination of desolation to be discussed below in Daniel being typically fulfilled in Antiochus Epiphanes to understand that the AD 69 through 70 siege by the Romans could be a type of a much more significant surrounding by Jerusalem in the end of days. In other words, you have, in a sense, the abomination seemingly fulfilled in some respects with Antiochus, but even Jesus says, well, not really, because it's still to come. Daniel spoke about it, so that was clearly typical. Could it not then be that this is somewhat typical of that which is even to follow also? It's possible that one could look at it that way. Christians then, let's see, where did I leave off? Let's see, I'm inclined to agree with that, but it says that part of the problem for the first century interpretation of Luke is the sequencing of events. Observe this order. Quote, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her dissolution is near. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains, but those who are in the midst of the city must leave, and those who are in the country must enter the city. Now here I'm trying to give, if I take it to be literally the AD 70 event, and that this is what Luke is talking about rather than it being typical of a later event, then I do have a couple of problems that maybe can be solved by some others here. Padfield interprets the text as saying, when the Roman army is coming to Jerusalem, hear the difference? I read Luke's passage where it says, when you see it surrounded, then do something. Padfield dealing with it says, when the people see the Roman army coming toward Jerusalem, then they're to do something. And I said, we don't have agreement there. I guarantee there's a lot of difference between the army coming to your city and surrounding your city, particularly if you're trying to get out of it. Quote, here the disciples are warned that when the Roman army is approaching Jerusalem, they were to flee for their lives. Christians receive ample warning about the approaching invasion. But the text actually says something quite different. That is, when, and then. Luke says that after the city of Jerusalem is already surrounded, people were to flee Judea. Note the description of Josephus. And I'm not going to give you the whole quote. I have a long quote here, but basically what this says is that he explains how it is that the Roman army covered the area. How many 5 miles? It was 40 furlongs, so about 5 miles of trenches around and walls around and guards around the city to make sure nobody could get out. And so there's a whole description in Josephus about how he did that. On the next statement also, he says he continues by describing the length of the wall and how the army has fortified it. Now, going on then. If Luke 21 speaks of the destruction of Jerusalem, this passage has support from the writings of Josephus in a manner differently from Matthew 24, I should say, and Mark 13. So get me? If Luke 21 is in fact talking about the destruction of Jerusalem then that does fit Josephus in some respects. See? But on the other hand, if this is talking about a later time, it doesn't. And clearly Mark and Matthew 24 and Mark 13 do not fit it. Luke 21 is an expansion of what is only a brief mention at the beginning of the synoptic parallels. The terminus ad quo is the surrounding of the city of Jerusalem by armies, and the terminus ad quem is the completion of the temple times of the Gentiles, which has only occurred recently. And that's another issue I have. It will be, basically kept, it will not have this freedom and independence until the time of the Gentiles has been complete. What about Great Tribulation? It is with difficulty that I do not enter into a more developed biblical exegesis in this paper, but my focus is whether the writings of Josephus record what is spoken of as in the Olivet Discourse. There is considerable data in the little apocalypses, that's I'm saying Matthew 24, Mark 13, that deserves attention. For my purpose, however, we need to discuss only one matter, the severity of the destruction of Jerusalem. Padfield says of the terrible slaughter and devastation of Jerusalem that people have often underestimated the severity of the Roman war against Jerusalem. There was great slaughter, destruction of the city, and blood in the streets. Approximately 1 million Jews died and 97,000 were carried into slavery. Now, no one can doubt the awesome devastation and death heaped upon Jerusalem by the Romans. My question is whether this destruction qualifies to fulfill the words of Jesus. Quote, "For then there will be great tribulation." That's after these things I've talked about. "There will be great tribulation such as not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will." The slaughter of millions before and since the destruction of Jerusalem has equaled and surpassed what occurred to the Jews in Jerusalem in AD 70. The apocalyptic horror foretold in a future war is more in view, in my opinion. That is, I think you can find many instances in the world and time in which there has been devastation on this magnitude. And what we find Jesus saying, he says, when that really happens, it will be such that will never ever be repeated. Nothing will ever be as great. And I suspect that there have been many instances of far more significance. I mean, I'm not minimizing what happened in Jerusalem, but there's been far more death and devastation than what one observed there. Now, the stars will fall from heaven. While preterists are content to interpret quite literally these events that precede Matthew 24:29, remember I had gentry, literally, well, they'll say all those are literal. For some reason, the remainder of the Matthean text is to be taken symbolically. In a slap at premillennialists, one says of these happenings, "To those unfamiliar with prophetic language, the premillennialists," this is a quote, should be a quote here, it's not in the text there. "To those unfamiliar with prophetic language, the premillennialists sometimes sound convincing. However, a short trip through the Old Testament will show how similar language was used to describe the fall of monarchs and nations," end quote. So all these things that we're going to see in a moment here, those aren't literal happenings. I mean, the falling from the sky and all the wars, all these things are literal because you've got to take them that way. But all these other things are not literal. That's talking about the rise and fall of nations. Okay. Apparently, since I'm a premillennialist, my understanding of prophetic language is somewhat limited. But I did compare the text he provides in his article and found no reason not to take most of them as literal in nature. That is, when I read the text, I said, so what? I think Dr. LaHaye maybe this morning, someone said, when the Scripture makes sense, seek no other sense, lest it be nonsense. Well, that's what we're talking about. When I read these passages, he said, oh, those got to be symbolical. I said, well, I can take them quite literally. Now, when I say literal fulfillment, I'm not doubting one may have figurative language to state a literal truth. But no passage of literature, even poetry, may be predominated with a metaphor or simile or the like, or the texts make no sense. You cannot have a text with just full of figurative language, or you lose meaning in a text. It must be the exception, not the rule. Let's look at Matthew 24:30 through 31 to determine whether the various comments should be taken in a plain sense or as figurative sense. The text reads, here are these things that must be symbolic, we're told. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory, and he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will be gathered together, his elect from the four winds, from the end of the sky to the other. Now, if the reference to darkening of the sun and the moon and falling of the stars are figures, one might be able to argue reasonably that they might fit into the actual fall of Jerusalem. That is, if they're all symbolic, then it's up to you to decide which portion of the Josephus account refers to it. Just make it up as you go. On the other hand, if you cannot argue symbolically here, then you've got to come up with some statements out of Josephus' works that show the sun not giving us light, the moon not giving us light, the stars falling from the sky, and obviously none of those occur in Josephus. And why then have they gone from literal to figurative? Because Josephus ran out of words. He should have been talking about these things. You know why he didn't? Because they didn't occur. On the other hand, if these are non-figurative events, no record of Josephus supports such phenomena, as they surely would have if he had seen these things. He had said something about it. Matter of fact, he had said more about these things than the others because they're more spectacular. Is it contrary to common sense or rational language to believe that the sun could be darkened? I've got to make that symbolic because how could the sun ever be darkened? Oh, okay. If the sun did not shine, is it reasonable to believe that the moon, as a reflection of the sun, would not provide light? Have stars, here clearly comets or meteors, ever fallen from the sky before? Could these types of phenomena rightly be called a shaking of the heavens? I fail to see why such descriptions should be seen in any other way than actual physical and literal events. In other words, I can't see this dichotomy between the others being absolutely have to be literal, and Josephus even mentions them, in some obscure, obtuse way, and yet these others, which to me are no more, unbelievable as far as literal events, are somehow symbolic because Josephus never speaks about them. Thomas Ice presents a study of the figurative references to the sun out of 164 and concludes that nothing in Matthew 24 leads toward a figurative usage. I think he found 4 examples of that might be considered maybe figurative in all those 164. We're all familiar with eclipses of the sun and the moon, not to mention the language possibilities speaking of clouds or particles in the air so dense that the light could not penetrate. And meteor showers and comets have been spoken of in ancient and modern sources, even by Josephus. Yet none of that possible description is found in Josephus regarding what is described in these verses. Now, when you go on to look at, I'm going to go ahead and move past this down to the next section, and that's false Christ and false worship, looking at my time. These are 2 areas that become important when you look at the question of Josephus. Does Josephus discuss false Christ, and does he talk about the abomination of desolation? And this is an area that we could actually write many, many more pages, but we'll just cover a little bit here. The coming of false Christ is the first in a list of several signs of his coming and the end of the age. This and the subsequent signs is in response to 2 questions. What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? The answer to their first question, namely, tell us what will these things happen, when will these things happen, was in response to Jesus' reaction to the disciples' admiration of the temple building. False messiahs preceded the birth of Jesus, were contemporaneous with him, and also arose after the ascension of Jesus. I think you could argue that that might be the case. There have been hundreds, if not thousands, of pretenders since the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. And I've made a statement here from one of my works that you can look at, and I'm not going to quote myself here. But essentially, we have the fact that Bar Kokhba, recognized by Rabbi Akiva as being the Messiah, starts a whole line of Messiahs over the many centuries from the time of this event in the first portion of the 2nd century. There's a new book coming out by a friend of mine, a professor on messiahs in the ancient, from the time of the Old Testament all the way to the modern era. And there have been literally thousands of messiahs. He's got a big encyclopedia of all of them and who they were and when and all this. And you can find many people that want to be at least some kind of messiah. But my issue here is not whether there may be individuals who have some kind of messianic complex or declared by their followers as being some kind of a messiah or not. The issue is whether you really do have a situation between AD 33 and the leaving of Jesus and the fall of Jerusalem as having anyone who is really the Messiah. Now, you need that to have happened in order to fulfill the preterist perspective. The difficulty with that is that you start looking for someone who's declared to be Messiah. And even though I do think you find some people to be called false prophets, for sure. And we mentioned some people here, an Egyptian, Theudas, and others who are rebels and so forth. But do you ever have anyone who really is looking like someone who is a Messiah, an Antichrist kind of figure? And what's interesting is that I don't find anybody who would fit that bill between AD 33 and 70. I do find some people that clearly were followed because they promised relief from Rome's domination. You do find some who are called false prophets. But it's really with the time of Bar Kokhba in AD 132 60 years after Jerusalem fell, that you have the first real Messiah come to the fore. So I think that Thomas Ice is essentially correct in his statements on this point, although I recognize that there is some difference of opinion on that. Now, abomination in the holy place, just to sort of finish some things off here. Does Josephus discuss the idea of the abomination that Jesus is talking about in Daniel? Now, let me say right up front that Josephus does mention this, and that could serve a study all on its own. But having said that, Josephus never relates it to what preterists relate it to. He talks about the Daniel passage and that there is this idea of abomination, but Josephus never connects that with the desecration of the Temple Mount by the Romans. And this is exactly the thing that preterists try to do, because they have either the Roman army standing across from the Temple Mount as being a desecration, or the Roman army destroying the temple as being a desecration. And then you try to figure out, but does that in any way satisfy what Josephus is discussing? And the answer is no. And is that in any way what we see in the Daniel text or in what Jesus is talking about in Matthew 24? In other words, you don't see the abomination of desolation occurring in the destruction of Jerusalem. That's the point. You have to have a very, very, very fertile and vivid imagination to get to that particular conclusion. And I'm not going to go into that. I do quote Lightfoot, who has an entertaining view. He says the wing of the as used in the Hebrew, and also the Septuagint when he speaks about the wing of the abomination of desolation, where he says that refers to the Roman army. And I haven't figured out how wing gets the Roman army yet. But I looked at the Hebrew. It actually says like the edge of, like the location of a structure. And I can't figure out how wing means Roman army. So I think that I know that, but it doesn't come. It doesn't come because a wing, I guess you could argue eagles have wings, but I looked at the Hebrew word, and the Hebrew word doesn't provide for eagle. So even if you have that, I don't find that you have a fulfillment of that. Let me go to conclusion, and I'm going to have time for questions. And my conclusion is very short because I decided not to write anymore. I thought this was enough for one time. Preterists offer a number of obscure, exaggerated, and generalized alleged fulfillments of the words of Jesus in the fall of Jerusalem. Supposedly, the writings of Josephus, particularly the Jewish War, offer strong comparisons with the words of Jesus, demonstrating that the destruction of Jerusalem is the primary fulfillment of the Olivet Discourse found in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. My reading of Josephus and the Olivet Discourse, other than in Luke's Gospel, finds virtually no connection between these accounts and is merely a fabrication of predisposed minds to a preterist interpretation of eschatology. Thank you.
I've got a question. Do you see any of Luke relating to AD 70?
Yeah, I said that earlier. I may not have been real clear on it. I do think that there may be the statement in Luke's gospel which talks about when you see the armies coming. I mean, that has a lot of similarity, obviously, with what you see in the coming of the armies against Jerusalem. My concern is that if that is, in fact, the exact thing it's talking about, some of the sequencing between what actually happened, we know from Josephus' account, and what you see in Luke's gospel seems a little bit off. It doesn't seem to quite fit. It's an obvious, just on the surface, you look and say, oh, yeah, that's a fulfillment. And I think it may be more typological even in fulfillment. That is, something like this occurs later on, which will occur again, because it's not an exact parallel. Yes?
Thank you, Dr. House, for your presentation. Regarding the flight of the Jews in Matthew 24, verses 15 and following, did you find anything in Josephus that in any way bears any resemblance? I know they have some things in Eusebius, but I was curious if anything in Josephus bears any resemblance to that flight.
Well, Eusebius mentions, and also Josephus mentions it, that there were some people that obviously left. What you find interesting is that before the Roman armies actually got to Jerusalem, lots of people left. And if it's not like our modern warfare where you have the planes attack real quick. You had quite a bit of build-up time for the people to leave Jerusalem if they want to get out of there. And we know from history that a lot of people went over into Jordan, into Pella, and so forth, and I think that's reasonable, and Eusebius mentions that. My concern in the issue, Mark and Matthew don't actually talk about the surrounding of the armies and the city and so forth. Luke does, and if Luke is a fulfillment of it, my issue is, though, that the Luke passage says that when you're surrounded, then leave Judea. He didn't say, by the way, when you're surrounded, leave Jerusalem. Because if you're surrounded, how do you get out of Jerusalem? You see my point? I don't see how that works. I can hear him say, if Luke had actually said, when you see the Roman armies approaching, from approaching Jerusalem, leave it, that would make sense to me. But since it says you're already surrounded, and I know you read Josephus' description of how they surrounded it. You know how they did Masada? You don't get out. You don't sneak through. I mean, every few paces you got a Roman soldier looking for you, standing on a wall, and you got this tall wall and you got trenches. I mean, it's not easy to get out. So it doesn't say if you see them approaching, when you're surrounded, leave Jerusalem. It says leave Judea. Over against, if they're approaching Jerusalem, you could leave Jerusalem. So I don't think the passages match. And Josephus does recognize that people did escape from Jerusalem before the Roman army got there. He talks about many people who tried to escape after the Roman army had got there, and they were killed. He talks about a lot of people being killed trying to get out. So anyway, that's how I view it.
Thank you for your presentation, Wayne. Over here.
Oh, hi there, Joe.
Your chart books have been so helpful and informative. Do you have any charts on Matthew 24, Luke 21, and preterism's view on that?
I came close to doing a chart on this stuff. I thought about it. I like to do charts. They're fun. I could do a charts on Josephus' War of the Jews. How would that do? Would that sell? No, I thought about that, but you can look at the parallels, and that's why I'm saying I'm trying to describe them to you. I don't see there's an exact comparison when you really look at the comparisons. Yeah.
Dispensationalists like to do charts.
Yeah, well, that's why if anybody needs more information on that, see me.
Yeah, I had a comment just on the Olivet Discourse and Mark, then versus Luke. What do you think about Matthew 24 and Luke 13 being exact parallels? Because it says Jesus sat on the Mount of Olives, and he asked 3 questions. What will the sign of these be? The sign of your coming and the end of the world. 3 questions versus Luke, while it only asks 2 questions. It says, as he looked up in the treasury, he saw the widow putting her mites in, and then they say, what will the sign of this time be, and when will these stones not be cast down? And then Luke answers both. So what do you think about Matthew and Mark not even ever touching a preterist, meaning surrounding Jerusalem, but that being total fulfilled, let's say in the year 2000 and whatever, versus Luke being taking a piece, because he says in 8-11, take heed that you not be deceived. He talks about the end, but then he says in 12, but before these things they will lay hands on you. That's Jerusalem. And then he says, woe unto you as you run. And then in 24 he talks about the diaspora until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled.
Okay, you said a lot there, and I'm hoping I catch all of that. If I'm understanding what you're saying, you recognize that Matthew 24 and Mark 13 are speaking of the same issue. Okay. Luke's gospel, I agree, does have that little introductory section, and then you move into the question of the answering, which also is talked about in the beginning of Matthew and Mark, also the answering in reference to these things. Just off the top of my head, and I'm about to be corrected here in a moment, I don't know, but let me just sort of give you my perspective. It seems to me that, like in many of the gospel accounts, you set pericopes in the middle of a discussion. And you realize all these things are not necessarily pericope to pericope. They're not all necessarily chronological. They're oftentimes set within a context of discussion. And I have difficulty understanding how you would have him answering the question about the temple and the destruction of the city and all those things one time, and then going right back up to Matthew in the Matthew and Markan text and answering exactly the same thing again. I know you're arguing 2 locations there, and what I'm suggesting is possibly, and I'm not looking at it in front of me here right now, but I would suggest that probably what occurs is that what we see in the beginning of Matthew and Mark, in which he answers the question, and what we have in Luke in a different setting, may actually be occurring on the Mount of Olives, so that Mark or Luke puts it in that context of the discussion he's trying to get over, the actual statement that is fulfilled in Matthew and Mark. In other words, Jesus, the setting of it, I think, is probably more within the context having left the temple and being there on the Mount of Olives. And Luke, when he uses it, puts it right after that other story. So I think it's only said probably one time. That's just off the top of my head. Yes, sir.
Well, I was going to suggest that a lot of these problems go away if we abandon the presumption that Luke 21 is equivalent to the Olivet Discourse. Matthew 24 and Mark 13 were given at night in confidence to 4 specific disciples.
You're saying, I want to be sure I understood that.
Yeah,
You're saying Mark and Matthew is given to only 4 disciples?
Yes. Peter, James, and John and Andrew are specifically detailed as the ones that he was dealing with in Matthew 24 and Mark 13.
Okay, I'll take a look
Luke
at that.
21 was given in the temple, not on the Mount of Olives, during the day.
Okay.
So there are 2 different presentations. Now, both presentations include a cluster of signs which Matthew calls the beginning of sorrows. But the key verse is verse 12 of Luke 21. It's, even though Jesus uses those expressions, he says before these, and then goes on to describe that they're going to be surrounded by armies and get out of town if they can. We need to understand that Titus and Vespasian were commissioned by Nero to get control of northern Galilee, and then Nero dies. For about 9 months they're quibbling as to who's going to take over till Vespasian finally decides to play his cards, and he goes to Rome and takes it over. And when he does, he tells Titus to finish the job. During that time, the armies are around Jerusalem, but they haven't sealed it off yet because Nero died and they had that upheaval. It's during that interval that Jesus has instructed his followers to get out of town and don't let your friends come back, because it cost their lives. Now, that means that the Luke 21 account is focusing on the AD 70 destruction of Jerusalem. In the Matthew account, you get to verse 15 and the abomination of desolation, and what he talks about is all after that. Mm-hmm. So there's 2 different destructions of Jerusalem in view, the one in AD 70 in Luke, and a final one, of course, eschatologically, if you will, in Matthew. Yeah. I think we all stumble because we've all presumed that all 3 passages are the same presentation. One of those is a different group at a different time with a different focus. And if you do that and you diagram it, it all flows.
Yeah. Well, that's something to think about. I'll have to check those specifics out to see what I think on that. But you did say one thing that got my interest. I mean, not to say the others didn't, but one thing in particular. Be careful over there. One thing in particular, and that is you were saying that hiatus between the time of Nero's death and Vespasian being emperor, that maybe the soldiers would have maybe lessened up their guard a little bit around Jerusalem. They were surrounding it, but maybe would not have. Yeah, but what I'm trying to deal with specifically is if they're surrounded by the Roman army.
They'd position themselves, but they didn't finish because Nero died, and all bets are off until that gets resolved.
So you're saying they slipped out during that time?
Sure. When the emperor dies, his decrees become null and void. And there was I think it was about 9 months where these 3 other guys they finally murdered each other off. Vespasian goes and takes over the empire. When he does, he tells his son to go ahead and finish the job with Jerusalem.
So that would answer part of that question, if that might be a possible explanation.
I've read that somewhere that the Roman army went back to Caesarea, just a hiatus there, the siege basically lifted.
Okay, so if that's true, and that's something we have to investigate, but if it's true that either that the lines lessened or the army probably or possibly moved back for a short time, that would give an opportunity to leave after they were surrounded. So maybe that would be it.
Luke 19, is specifically talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. And so Luke 21, 20 through 24 is as well. So Luke is clearly focused more on the AD 70 event than the others are.
And I think that's reasonable. That's sort of where I came out, but there were some still questions in my mind. Yes.
Changing the subject, I missed the connection between Paul and his Colossians comment about the gospel being preached. It seemed like if Paul said that in 60, and they're saying it was fulfilled in 70, it's like Paul's saying, I got 10 more years to get it done.
Well, what I was
Or did I
making,
miss it?
what I was making on the point of Paul is they were saying that the gospel will preach in all the kingdom, and then the end will come, and that if the preaching to the nations had actually all occurred, let's say before AD 70, then at that point, let's say, well, we got AD 70 now. Now judgment can come on the Jews. But I'm saying Paul, he made his statement about preaching. It's already been done, so that actually all the preaching had been finished by AD 60. That left a 10-year time period in which there was apparently there was no need to preach the gospel to the nations anymore.
What passage is that in Colossians?
I wrote it down here. Anybody know right off the top of your head?
1 or 3.
I think it's in 3.
They would say that's Christ saying that to the disciples, that the gospel we preached. So he's saying that in 33 or 30, whenever that was.
Yeah, but the imminency question, even in reference to the destruction of Jerusalem, I think is significant, because if that happens actually before 60, then you're saying more than 10 years. When he says, when that happens, then the end will come, he says, man, he sure waited around a while, another 10 years, and he had already accomplished the purposes. And, that it just doesn't seem to carry on this same kind of imminency idea that I see in the text.
There's an epistolary statement that the gospel has been preached throughout the earth, or every place under the sky, or something like that.
Yeah.
And I remember reading a bunch of commentaries on that one time, and thought that a lot of people thought that relates to the introduction of the gospel.
Yeah, but that's not what they're saying, I don't think. But
Well, that's not what they're saying.
the big issue to me in that whole discussion is not the Paul statement, but that in Matthew 24, if all the nations there refers to essentially what is in the rim of the Mediterranean, then how are we to take Matthew 28 about preaching or teaching to all the nations? We don't have any responsibilities anymore. It's all been done a long time ago.
And they just blow that off or dismiss it, because then they turn around as postmillennialists and make the Great Commission their big marching orders for now, where they restate the cultural mandate in the Great Commission.
Yeah. Somebody else? Right here.
Dr. House, thank you for all of your work. In your reading and study of the writings of Josephus, have you come across anything about a 7-year covenant, or tracking all buying and selling, or a mark of the beast, or a 10?
Yeah, Josephus deals, as even some others do, with trying to explain what's going on in the 70 weeks and so forth. There's some of that there, but I pretty well passed by that, because that wasn't germane to what I was going to try to do. But yeah, there is some discussion there. But I really wouldn't want to try to speak to what it is, because I didn't take the time to study it. But he's aware of Daniel. He's aware of the events. I mean, I don't see that just in my initial reading and just what I remember, I don't see him taking some of the argument that you see in, for example, some of the early fathers who see an interlopal period, or what we think of as a break, that I think is true. That idea of there being a break between the 69th and 70th weeks, which to me is pivotal in our discussion. I don't think it sort of hit their heads very much. They didn't figure that out. That would require a 7-year covenant and those things, yeah. But I don't see any of that discussion in their views, yeah.
You mentioned on that these were not on the CD. It'd be on a website or on the internet.
The remainder of the paper, I think about the first 6 or 7 pages is
Where on the internet would that be?
The internet will be on pretrib.org. The whole talk will be on that, yeah.
This maybe a little bit lighter in subject over here.
Hi.
Just so you know, Canadians have stomped out preterism because we believe that Obama's Nation of Desolation begins on January 20th.
All right. That's Canadians.
I'm
all
sorry,
right.
I won't talk anymore.
All right. Appreciate that Canadian humor. All right.
Yes, Dr. House, thank you very much for that presentation. Let me ask you, I know that Josephus mentions specifically that after the destruction of Jerusalem, the ground was laid level where you would not have known that anything had ever been there before, and seems to be a very precise fulfillment of a couple of passages in the Gospels. One of them in Luke chapter 19 is talking about the city. Luke chapter 19, verse 44, but in Matthew 24, it's talking about the temple, using the same terminology, not one stone will be left upon another. Now, Josephus also mentions that the Romans specifically left 3 towers standing of the city so that the people who came thither afterward would be able to see what a magnificent place had been destroyed. What is your feeling about the precision of the prophecies that not one stone will be left upon another, one of them applying specifically to the city, the other one to the temple?
Yeah, well, that's largely true, I think. You know, again, I want to say that I don't think Josephus always uses entirely exact language. Sometimes it's an exaggeration. I think there's some of that. You know, I suspect if you could take the time, you could have probably dug up a little ground and found some stones. You know, but it largely was just leveled. You're right on that. But you've got to deal with the fact that Titus did want to leave some evidence that what had happened there had been important, and that was for his glory, not anybody else's. I think that's true also. So I'd want to look at the Luke 19 passage to see exactly what it says. But it is true that Jerusalem was largely level, but they did leave some walls up that we know of. And you can even go into some of the places were later on built up by the Muslims and by the Byzantines and other people along the way. There are lower stones that you can find not only on the western wall but around that, you know, they didn't dig these things up necessarily and get rid of them. They just largely sort of scraped off the top. And I think that is true. Is that what you're saying?
Well, pretty much. I understand that the Temple Mount today is simply the foundation of the temple, and so in your estimation, would the stones pretty much have been leveled of the temple?
On top of the Temple Mount,
yes.
Everything on top of that's gone.
Yes.
Now, I don't think that's an issue. The question in my mind is on the city itself that surrounded the whole Temple Mount.
Yeah.
To what degree was the destruction of that city, and it was largely leveled also.
Same terminology used on the city in Luke chapter 19, verse 44, not one stone left upon another, and I was aware of at least the towers were left standing.
Yeah, well, the towers were, but he did that, and also a portion of what we think is a western wall. When you look at how those stones were pushed over the side, I mean, portions of the western wall today clearly are going back to the first century. So he didn't knock out everything. He left part of that standing for the purpose of demonstrating how great the place was that he conquered, and so that's connected to that. And also remember, when you have the kind of stone that they have there, it burned. You know, the kind of stone that you're using in building in Jerusalem. When you set it afire, you don't have much left because it burns up and it just turns into dust, as it were. So that wasn't too hard to do when they started burning things and looting and so forth. So I think, Josephus is pretty accurate in that. Anybody else?
Yes, hello, Wayne. I appreciate your
Hi.
very scholarly presentation. I'm just a layman, so I realize I'm somewhat out of my element when I engage in discussing these things with you and others. But I'd like to offer kind of a layman's observation. When you read prophecy, all the prophets, starting with Isaiah coming forward through Zechariah, you will see, with maybe one or two exceptions, that all of those prophetic accounts are leading to the events leading up to the establishment of the millennial kingdom. They're concerned with that. I mean, that, as I understand it, that is God's major goal for the end of human history, is to bring us into that golden age of the millennial kingdom. So with that in mind, you see that the prophets, by and large, will start their prophecy by giving a prophecy of something that's going to come to pass in the generation of the hearers in which that prophecy is given. This is to conform with the very high standards of Deuteronomy 18, which give the definition of who is truly speaking for God, who is raised up of God. It must be the truth. It must come to pass If that prophecy does not come to pass, then that prophet is not of God. I think Jesus was conforming to that very same standard. In verse 2 of Matthew 24, he gives a near-term prophecy of the destruction of the temple, which was to occur in about 40 years. With that in place, those hearers would see that come to pass, and then he launches into, like the other prophets, the events leading up to the millennial kingdom. And as a matter of fact, you can start in verse 27, and you'll see that these events he's talking about are closely tied to the coming of the Son of Man. I think these preterists fail to understand the nature of biblical prophecy, and I think that they are in very quicksand when they start looking outside the Bible to interpret the Scriptures. Scriptures, I hold, are self-validating, and these preterists have no standing. The biggest proof of their failure in this preterist point of view is that Christ has not returned yet. And that's what his whole prophecy is about. Once Christ gives the near-term prophecy of the destruction of the temple, then the events that are going to lead up to his return. They completely miss everything.
Yeah. Well, I concur.
Thank you, Wayne.
Thank